Welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
This is where we take sources you're interested in, things maybe you've seen online, and we really, get into them.
Yeah, we pull out the key bits, the important insights, so you can feel well informed without getting sort of bogged down.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into a YouTube transcript. It features the father of Nasser Zefzafi.
Right, Zefzafi being a really central figure among the detainees from Morocco's Iraq Rif movement.
So this source, it's very personal, isn't it? It's his father's account, his message.
Absolutely. It gives a really direct perspective. You hear about the events, the conditions, what the families are going through, straight from someone experiencing it.
So our mission then, for this deep dive, is to really grasp the main points he's making.
Yeah.
The grievances, the perspectives on why they were detained, the allegations, the impact.
Yeah, understanding his side of the story based on this source.
Okay, so let's get into it. One of the first big things he talks about is this decision by the detainees to renounce their Moroccan citizenship. What did you make of that?
Well, what's really striking is how the father frames it. He says, he heard about it during a prison visit, shared the news.
He makes it clear it's their decision, right? But he has his own take.
Exactly. He doesn't really present it as them abandoning Morocco. Instead, he flips it. He points to people in power, maybe with dual citizenship, multiple citizenships.
Ah, right. He says they're the ones who've really abandoned their citizenship, effectively.
Contrasting them with the detainees who, he claims, were sort of pressured into this renunciation or felt they had no other choice because the state failed them.
It's a powerful framing. Makes you think about loyalty and belonging, doesn't it?
Definitely. And this idea of the state potentially failing them leads right into the actual charges they faced.
What does the father say about those specifics from the police reports he mentions?
He lays them out quite clearly, undermining state stability, getting support from outside forces. He specifically names the Polisario Front and Algeria as being mentioned in those reports.
And he also mentions the government line, that they were quickly labeled separatists.
Yes. And his position is that these charges are baseless, completely unjust.
And that the heavy sentences they received were a direct consequence of these accusations.
Precisely. He argues the sentences were built on this flawed foundation. And that's where he brings in the history.
The historical context, yeah.
Yeah.
He questions the whole separatist label by looking back.
Right. He talks about the Rif War of Liberation back in the 1920s. He emphasizes that, historically, the Rif wasn't trying to separate from Morocco.
Their fight was against Spain initially.
That's his point. He mentions Rif fighters liberating cities like Taza, besieging others, all directed against Spanish forces at first. He sees the French involvement later as what really complicated things and ultimately harmed the Rif cause.
So he's suggesting this history of resistance against colonial powers is maybe being twisted now, or perhaps resented.
That seems to be the implication, that maybe some resent the Rif's historical unwillingness to just bow down to external control.
And this historical perspective seems absolutely key to understanding his condemnation of the justice system and how the detainees were treated.
Oh, absolutely. He doesn't mince words. He talks about abductions, alleges torture, solitary confinement for 15 months.
15 months, wow.
Yeah. And he calls the trial itself a farce, like a poorly staged play.
He says the verdict was basically decided beforehand, and the appeal just confirmed it.
That's his view. An unjust initial verdict, unjustly upheld. And it didn't stop there.
What happened after the final verdict, according to him?
Dispersal. He says they were intentionally scattered across different prisons all over Morocco.
Which must make things incredibly difficult for the families.
Immensely. And it leads him to ask that really fundamental question. What does loyalty to your country even mean if that country allows this kind of treatment, if it doesn't protect you?
It's a stark question. And it brings us straight to the suffering of the families, which he describes in, heartbreaking detail.
He does. He mentions mothers seriously ill who weren't even allowed to attend their own children's funerals.
That's just awful.
He accuses the state of indifference, trivializing their pain, treating them with contempt. It really highlights the human cost behind the politics.
He then talks about the power dynamics involved, the Moxen versus the detainees.
Yeah, the Moxen, that established power structure.
Yeah.
He acknowledges it's strong, powerful.
And contrasts it with the detainees, who he says are just young people, really. They only have their voices.
Exactly. And he points out this paradox, or what he sees as a paradox. Why would this incredibly powerful state seem so, afraid of these young, ordinary individuals? Why keep them locked up?
He emphasizes their backgrounds, too, doesn't he? Some married, others from marginalized areas. Just regular people, essentially.
Yes, grounding them in everyday Moroccan life, and this perceived injustice leads him to make comparisons.
Like with the Jarada detainees.
Right. He asks why those protesters were released, but the ones from the RIF are still imprisoned. He suggests the whole RIF issue is just being ignored by the official bodies, government, parliament, political parties.
Implying the Maxim is acting on its own here.
That seems to be his implication, that decisions are being made outside the usual political channels. He also pushes back hard against any claims his son Nasser is in good health.
What does he say about that?
He mentions repeated hospital visits, a specific skin condition made worse by sweat in prison, something apparently not being properly treated.
So a direct counter to any official reassurances.
Definitely. And he even draws a comparison to arrests back in 1959, arguing things are actually worse now. He mentions incidents of abuse. It suggests a pattern or even an escalation in his view.
This concern about treatment naturally extends to the present conditions and transfers he talks about.
Yeah, he gives a very specific example. A detainee moved from Al Hoceima, his home region, all the way to Meknes.
And placed with dangerous criminals.
Yes, which the father interprets as purely punitive, an act of revenge, he suggests.
He also mentions an incident at Toulon prison with a guard being killed.
He does, and he makes a point of saying he's committed to telling the truth about these things, even when they're grim.
But it's not all negative regarding the prisons, is it? He mentions Ras El Ma.
Interestingly, yes. He specifically says his family has no complaints about the administration or staff at Ras El Ma where their relatives are held.
Okay, so it varies. But he does describe major problems elsewhere.
Particularly Tangier and also Nador to some extent. He talks about families facing real difficulties trying to visit, restrictions on how often they can visit, what they can bring.
Like basic necessities or comfort items?
Presumably. And he even calls out the local CNDH rep, the National Council for Human Rights person in Tangier.
For what?
For allegedly inappropriate behavior towards a prisoner who was on hunger strike, at least initially. It paints a picture of inconsistent and sometimes obstructive conditions for families.
And you mentioned the difficulty for families earlier. He really emphasizes the sheer logistical nightmare of these visits, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He describes these incredibly long, exhausting journeys families have to make just to see their loved ones for a short time. Across the country, often.
The physical toll, the emotional drain,
Yeah.
the cost.
Exactly. And he points out that some previous support, like transportation assistance from the National Council for Human Rights, has apparently been stopped.
Making it even harder for families, especially those without many resources.
Precisely. Which feeds into his broader skepticism about the National Council for Human Rights, the CNDH.
He seems quite baffled, almost sarcastic, about their role.
He does. He almost implies, were they involved in the arrests? It's said with deep frustration, obviously.
And he brings up their report, the CNDH report on the detainees.
Yes. He questions why it has been released. He seems convinced that the report details torture and mistreatment so clearly.
That it would force their release if it came out.
That's his belief. That the evidence in that report from investigations in Al Hoceima and Ukacha prisons is damning.
And he contrasts this with the official stance, like the public prosecutor dismissing the torture claims.
And he mentions that seemingly absurd accusation against his son, Nasser Zefzafi, about overpowering dozens of people by himself. It all fuels his sense of deep injustice.
Did he mention any attempts to mediate, to find a resolution?
He says he himself offered to mediate, to talk with his son and the others.
But he was rejected.
Yeah, apparently officials felt he didn't offer enough guarantees, whatever that means in this context. He also mentions another mediator, Ahmed El Hajj, seems to have fallen out of favor too.
So dialogue seems blocked. He does mention someone supportive, though.
Yes, Nabila Munib, the political figure. He notes she participates in protests, showing solidarity.
But ultimately, where does he seem to place his hope for their release?
It really seems to come down to the king. He talks about the royal pardon.
And that saying, Tu aikietat janiara.
Forgiveness at the time of power. Exactly. He emphasizes that the king has the authority, the power, to resolve this with just a decree.
He even mentions people caught up who maybe weren't even really involved.
Yeah, like a neighbor injured just trying to park his car during the events. He's appealing for a broad resolution, it seems.
This then shifts into a really passionate section about the RIF flag.
It does. You can really feel the emotion here. He
Yeah.
talks about its history, what it represents.
Crying against colonialism,
Yeah?
Spain and France.
Yes. He frames it as the banner under which people fought colonialism, inspiring others worldwide. It's deeply tied to Rif identity and resistance for him.
And he makes a pretty radical call, doesn't he, to replace the current Moroccan flag.
He does. He calls for the Rif flag to be officially recognized, even suggests it should be the national flag, viewing the current one as a symbol imposed during colonial times.
And those who died defending the Rif under that flag are the true patriots in his eyes.
That's the essence of it. He highlights the intensity of the Rif resistance historically, mentioning the fight even against chemical weapons,
Drawing a parallel with Japan, only surrendering after atomic bombs.
to emphasize the level of defiance. And now, he laments, that same historically significant flag is banned.
In Alosima, maybe everywhere, along with the Amazigh flag.
That's what he states. And he describes a heavy security presence in Albacema now, implying any protest, any display of these symbols would lead to immediate mass arrests.
Despite all this pressure, this history, he seems to convey a sense of resolve from the detainees.
Absolutely. He's very clear. Nasser Zefzafi isn't looking for political asylum. He's not going to flee.
He frames it as them not fleeing the nation, but fleeing those who've wronged the nation.
Yes, another interesting distinction he makes. And he defends Nasser's actions, particularly right after Mohsen Fikri's death.
The initial protests.
Yeah, the ones with candles, flowers. He praises them as peaceful, civilized, organized by these ordinary young men.
Contrasting it with alleged misconduct by security forces later on, like theft or vandalism.
He questions why Nasser's arrest had to be so dramatic, saying he was easily found, often at cafes or even near police stations.
And he points out inconsistencies in the charges again, how things escalated.
Right, how the initial warrant related to interrupting a mosque sermon, but then charges like separatism and destabilizing the country got added later.
He finds the idea of Nasser leading some kind of criminal organization absurd.
Utterly. And this is where he makes that powerful connection to Abdelkrim el-Khattabi.
The historical Rif leader.
Yes. He mentions being reminded of him in court, touches on the injustices el-Khattabi faced exile, his capital Ajdir destroyed.
It's a deep historical wound he's connecting to the present. He even brings in Gaddafi.
In a sort of complex comparison, yeah. Contrasting maybe Gaddafi's self-aggrandizement with how el-Khattabi was treated historically, but also noting how Gaddafi eventually did recognize Omar Mukhtar in Libya.
His main point being that el-Khattabi, whose tactics are studied globally, isn't properly honored in Morocco.
Exactly. A major historical figure, a symbol of Rif resistance, yet marginalized in the national narrative, he suggests.
And he even implies the Rif region itself has suffered because of this association.
That seems to be the undercurrent, that the legacy of el-Khattabi has somehow led to the region being neglected or punished. His final thoughts really circle back to the suffering.
He struggles to find words for it.
He says he lacks the words, yeah. The profound suffering of the detainees, the families. He mentions some families have it even harder.
Like the mother with 3 sons in different prisons.
Just unimaginable hardship. And he expresses this absolute refusal to forgive those responsible.
Recounting a prayer from another mother.
A very intense one, yeah. Praying that those responsible experience the consequences of their actions while still being fully aware. It's raw.
But he ends on a note of resilience, too.
He does. He says, those in power can do what they want, but the Rif people will stay true to their values. He also gives credit to the wider Moroccan public
For their support, like the protests in Rabat.
Yes, he saw those protests as a kind of referendum, showing solidarity. He acknowledges the general hardships Moroccans face, too.
And his final message is to the detainees themselves.
To stay united, stay strong, be patient. A message of support, acknowledging their plight but urging perseverance.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've really heard, through this father's account, some incredibly powerful points.
Definitely. The perspective on renouncing citizenship, the flat-out rejection of the official charges, rooting it all in Rif history and identity.
And that sharp critique of the justice system, plus just the deeply personal stories of the family's suffering, it paints a stark picture.
The human cost comes through so clearly, and the symbolism, especially around the Rif flag, speaks volumes about identity and historical memory.
Yeah, it really forces you, the listener, to consider these different viewpoints, the underlying issues about regional identity, history, justice.
And it leaves us with a pretty significant thought to ponder, doesn't it?
Which,
Well, how does a nation, any nation really, reckon with its past? How does it genuinely address these kinds of deep-seated grievances tied to regional identity, historical events.
In a way that actually leads to justice and, holds the society together for everyone.
Exactly. It's a huge question, and this father's testimony, the source we've explored, certainly gives you a lot to think about in that context.